Morning to the Lubbock Seventh-day Adventist Church family of the Texaco Conference family of God. What a privilege it is to be with you here today, this wonderful service. This is one of my favorite churches to attend. We have one of the elders from one of our neighboring churches here today, and so I just want him to tune his ears out for a second as I tell you how much of a blessing it is to be part of this family. I also want to tell you that I think you have the very best bulletin in the entire conference. I emailed Kathy this week after she sent me a copy of it, and I said, you know, it's just amazing, all the information you share and all of the incredible activities that are going on in the Lubbock Church. It's just wonderful. And so we just simply go another direction with the mic. No worries. But anyway, to come together today, and this weather indicates that we are talking with and worshiping with a wonderfully committed group of Seventh-day Adventist Christians. So our hearts are full and are of gratitude, and we have come together today to worship and to give him glory. I would briefly like to ask that we visit together about two familiar stories today. One is a really truly story, and the other is a parable that Jesus used to illustrate a lesson in grace and forgiveness. The first story is the real one, and although it's recorded in each of the four gospel accounts, each of their telling shares a little bit different parts of the story with us. The story begins less than a week before the crucifixion of Christ. Here we find Mary of Bethany, Simon the leper, who was a Pharisee, and yes, Jesus was there. Now we know that Lazarus and Mary lived in Bethany with their sister Martha. And it had only been a couple of months since the events that we read about in John 11 had been front page news. Lazarus, dead, living again. Everybody heard about it. It's a big deal in this little town. And now Jesus is in Bethany again, the weekend before his crucifixion. Let's pick up the story in Luke's Gospel, beginning with chapter 7. And we're just going to look at verse 36 to 39 briefly this morning. Luke 7, verse 36. Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Luke is one of the gospel accounts to identify this host as Simon. However, both Matthew and Mark provide the additional detail that Simon had been healed of leprosy by Jesus. And John is the only gospel writer to identify the woman in this story as Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. If we take a look around the room, guests at a feast remove their sandals before the meal, recline on their left side up toward the table on couches that were spread around on three sides. They would rest their left elbow on the table and their feet would be at the lower end of the couches. The host of this dinner party we've already heard was Simon, who was a Pharisee. And even though he was sort of a follower of Christ, he had not yet come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. When he saw what Mary was doing, he just immediately began to find fault with her and with her actions. Simon began to question how Jesus could be the Messiah if he didn't even know the background of this woman. Why, she was such a great sinner that someone claiming to be the Christ should not even let her near him, much less allow her to touch him. Now, you would think that Simon would be a bit more sensitive to this whole concept of touch. Jesus had saved him from his own living death as a leper, a condition in which he would be considered by all the people to be totally unclean. He could touch no one, and no one would touch him. Those days were over now for Simon because of the healing grace of Jesus. But Simon, in all of his fret and worry about this event, was trying to extend this same treatment to Mary. Some scholars will even tell us that it was Simon who led Mary into her life of sin. In fact, he had wounded her deeply, and now he wanted to push her down further. Incredible. In the midst of this situation, Jesus told the story of two men. It just continues in chapter 7. We're not going to take time to read it today. But he told the group that was there assembled this story about two men who had been in debt. Both of them owed different amounts, but neither one of them could afford to pay it back. And Jesus told that the creditor canceled the debts for both men. They both had a newly adjusted balance due line on their statement that said 0. Now it was the same. Jesus asked Simon which one he thought would love his creditor more. Which one would be the most grateful? Well, I guess it would be the one for whom he forgave the greater debt, Simon said. Now Jesus draws the contrast between Simon and Mary. While Simon had defied the long-standing custom of not bringing water to wash Jesus' feet when he had entered his home, Mary had not only washed his feet with the tears of her grateful heart, but she had also anointed them with an expensive fragrance. And isn't it interesting to note that just a few days later, as the disciples gathered with Jesus in the upper room as the Passover was beginning, that even though there was a basin, there was water, and a towel, not one of these guys volunteered to wash the feet of the Master. They had been with Jesus for 3+ years. They were all present at Simon's house, and they no doubt heard Jesus' comments regarding his failure to wash the feet of his guest. Yet they still didn't get it. The second story I'd like to have us consider this morning, it's another story of grace and forgiveness. It's a parable. It's also found in the book of Luke, and it's in the 15th chapter. There are 3 such stories that are just very, very well known. But I'd like for us to just focus for a few moments on the third one. We won't take time to read it, but you're very familiar with it. You've all heard of the prodigal son. The story that Jesus told that day shocked his listeners. A story really about 2 sons. Both needed forgiveness, but only one of them came right out and asked for it. The youngest son perhaps did the worst thing imaginable against a father. It was customary to divide up the assets of a father's estate and to give them to his heirs, his offspring. The older one, double portion, everybody else shared equally beyond that. All of this is well and good. They were used to this story. They were used to what happened when someone of his stature passed away. But in this story, the younger son is demanding 1/3, which would be the part that's left over after the double portion in a 2-son family. He was asking, not only asking, he was demanding that he wanted the proceeds of the father's estate now, while he was still alive. And what this younger son was actually saying by his demands was that his father was worth more to him dead than alive. Incredible. In almost every ancient culture, the response to such a request would have been to severely punish such an incredibly disrespectful son. However, the father in this story agreed to grant this disrespectful request, and the young man takes off to enjoy his new life. By the act of leaving home and traveling to a far country, the son is basically declaring that he's turning his back on or rejecting everything that his dad stood for and believed in. He was on his own, on a new course, on a new path of his life. Going to do his own thing, as it were. There's a really familiar story to this one, found in a little bit of history. It's in the 17th century artist's life, a man by the name of Rembrandt. As a young man, he lived the high life, and in fact, not long after his marriage, he painted a picture of a couple in a suggestive party pose in a brothel in the Netherlands. And in this painting, he used both the face of his wife and his own face as well. And he titled it, "The Prodigal Son in a Tavern." Rembrandt made a lot of money and experienced great fame in his life. He lived for the moment, took incredible risks financially and socially. Some years later, his wife became ill and passed away. And then 3 of his children died as well. And in his pursuit of happiness, he ended up losing everything that he had. His debts grew so great that his assets, including his art collection and even his house, were all sold at auction so that people could recover a bit of what he owed them. The status and fame that he had once enjoyed as an artist had pretty much faded away by the time he painted one of his last works. In this painting, he portrayed himself as a changed man. He was a man who had come to know God as a loving Father, who was overwhelmed by the power of forgiveness and grace that he had experienced in the relationship that had developed between him and God. Once again, Rembrandt used his own face in the painting. This time he was a softened and gracious older man. The face reflected a changed heart that flowed outward in a strong embrace of forgiveness and deep compassion. This time, the painting was called Return of the Prodigal. I've looked at that painting. I saw it again this morning. You can find it as well just by Googling Rembrandt, The Prodigal Son Returns. It's a moving scene painted by a changed man. But when I studied this painting carefully, I was impressed by the absence of something that would likely have been part of the story that we read in the Bible, as it was that Rembrandt was trying to portray a part of what that meant to him. Imagine, as a parent, you've been anxiously looking down the lonely road, day after awful day. All that you could see was the mirage of empty dreams and brokenness. When will he come home? Is he going to come home? What can I do? Where will I find him? What is he doing now? God, please bring him back. And then all of a sudden, without any notice, what you've been longing for all these days and months, however long, becomes a reality. There he is, bowing before you with an unqualified confession, no excuses, but just a flood of apologies pouring forth, and a request that his dad allow him to just be an employee if he could be there again. And in the painting that Rembrandt painted, I can imagine grace and forgiveness flowing in deep rivers of reconciliation between the hearts of these two men, father and son. Father putting a robe and a ring on his boy. I can also imagine the father kneeling over a basin of water and washing the soiled feet of his son, who was lost, but who is now come home again. After all, this was in his culture such a very important gesture of welcome and honor and belonging. As a son myself, I know a little bit of what that might feel like. And while I didn't leave home and I didn't dishonor my dad intentionally, I'm sure I must have many times, I'll never forget the first time that he washed my feet. It was the day that I was to participate in my first communion service. I remember being excited, but also a little anxious as to how it would all work out. As a child, I had witnessed it many, many times, but now I was going to be involved. My dad was leading out in the service as the pastor. He was very engaged in caring for all of his responsibilities. And for a while, after we separated for the ordinance of service, I looked for someone to participate with me. But everyone seemed to already have a partner. So I just waited for everyone to finish washing each other's feet and then return to the sanctuary with the others. I didn't say anything to anyone about my challenge in finding a partner. But that night, as we were preparing for bed, my dad asked me who had washed my feet that morning. When I told him that I hadn't found anyone to be my partner, he was suddenly very, very quiet. I could tell it was one of those moments when a dad wished that he could somehow turn back time to have sort of a do-over, if you will. Oh my, how could this have happened? He put his arm around my shoulder and we began to walk toward the kitchen. Sat me in a chair and quietly put water in a basin. Then he knelt before me and washed my feet. And as he did, he told me that he was so sorry that I had been left out, and he wanted me to know that I was more important to him than it must have seemed earlier in the day. Father and son, kitchen, together. And in that moment, with my feet in my Father's hands, in my young heart, I had the overwhelming sense that all was right with my world. He gave me an example that night that I will never forget. Examples are important. In fact, it's really what Jesus was doing that night in the upper room. He put the apron around his waist, took the basin, and washed the disciples' feet. Listen to his words recorded in John 13, verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. But now that I have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent me. Now that you know these things, happy and blessed are you if you do them." My friends, each of us has our own story. For some, there may have been a time when we've walked away from a relationship with God, a relationship that the Father longs to have with each of us. Yet others have been here all along, but maybe just kind of settling into the routine, going through the motions, if you will. All of it is important for us to consider this morning. When we go through the motions, when we walk away from his relationship, it becomes more difficult to see the depth of his grace and maybe even our need for forgiveness. But the truth of the matter is that we're all sinners in need of a Savior. We all have the same balance on our statement of account, 0, when it comes to what we can do to provide salvation or any hope for the future. Just alike sinners. We've all been offered the same forgiveness through the one who died the death that we deserve, so that we can have the life that only he deserves. What a gift. What grace. This morning, my prayer is that as we bow before one another and wash each other's feet, that we will be reminded that Jesus also said that what we do for each other, we do as unto him. As we bow before a brother, a sister, a spouse, or perhaps even a child, why not let your mind review the magnitude of the debt that Jesus has canceled for you when he went to the cross? And throughout this important experience, may we find joy in serving each other, is my prayer. This morning, it is our privilege and opportunity to engage in this service, this ordinance of service. Some call it humility. It's not normal and common in our world today to bow before someone and wash their feet. But Jesus has said that was his example, and he has invited us to do the same. And so today, provisions have been made for men to participate together with other men in classroom 1, women only in classroom 2, couples in the church parlor, and families in the conference center. Today, may it be an opportunity for us to reflect once again on the fact that we witnessed a baptism today, but like Jesus told Peter, you don't need to be washed all over again, but let me wash your feet. It's a renewal, a recommitment of that whole idea of baptism. And may it be a wonderful blessing to each of us as we share in it together. Father, thank you for this time, for this privilege, for the example of Jesus. May we serve as he did and does. In his name we pray. Amen.